Hello and welcome to my podcast. I am your host, Lana the Educator. Today we are joined by a rising voice in contemporary poetry whose work has been making waves across continents. She brings a fresh perspective to the literary landscape, weaving together Caribbean influences with global themes in her acclaimed new chapbook, Jurassic Coast. From her early days in the Cropper Foundation Caribbean Writers Workshop to her recent fellowship at the Corsicana Artist and Writer Residency, she has been honing her craft and collecting accolades along the way, including the prestigious Bocas Lit Fest Emerging Writers Fellowship for Poetry. Her work has found homes in some of the most respected literary journals, from the Caribbean Writer to Cordite Poetry Review. Join me in welcoming Jannine Horsford.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here and so honored as well.
It's wonderful to have you here today. And, I've been particularly struck, by the poems and the poetry here, especially the titles. So
right. Okay.
to ask you about that. But first off, what is a chapbook? I don't think it's one that we are very much familiar with picking up in bookstores or even familiar with here in the Caribbean.
Right. Yeah. So, not sure I'm the best person to ask, but I'll tell you from my experience. So, a chapbook is it's just I would consider it a kind of sampler of a let's say a poet's longer collection. I think many of the poets with whose work I'm familiar produced chapbooks before the full-length collection. And it's a way of introducing the work to like a potential market. It gives the reader a sense of the poet's aesthetic, and it also gives the reader something to look forward to. I think as a writer, based on my experience of it, it has really kind of prepared me in a sense for the world of publishing. And I think there's nothing like seeing your work in print.
Yeah.
And because I am working on my full-length collection, this has given me a good sense of where I want to go with this collection and what perhaps the response to it will be by the reader, etc. Right? I think there are various like lengths. In my case, my chapbook is 16 pages. I've seen some that are perhaps a little longer as well, and perhaps shorter.
Right. Good. I think you did a good job. I think at least I understand what it means to do it.
Okay,
And of course, then the second thing, I said, oh, I'm going to buy Jannine's book. And then I found it's a chapbook because I looked at the description that they have in terms of what is happening with the piece itself. And then the title, obviously, is what caught my eye, Jurassic Coast. So what was the thought and inspiration behind that?
Okay.
Of course, I was thinking nonsense because I was telling my friend, where she came up with this title, Jurassic, I know it's Jurassic Park and dinosaur and thing, how does that apply to the Caribbean? So
okay.
I will ask her and then I'll get back to you.
Right. I understand. So so this chapbook, so let me just provide some context. This chapbook is published by Peekash Press. And the publication of the chapbook was actually, let's say, the last installment in the fellowship, which I won in 2022. I had been working on a collection of poems about England. In fact, I have been working on for quite a long time, right? And so in working through the poems, I found that certain poems came to the fore, and they were the poems which kind of focused on the Jurassic Coast, etc. So let me be even clearer. So the long collection I'm working on examines 2 years which I spent in England in 2003 to 2005. In that first year, I stayed in a town called Exmouth,
Mm.
And Exmouth is actually located on the Jurassic Coast. The Jurassic Coast is a World Heritage Site, which actually contains 185 million years of continuous history. It spans from Exmouth in East Devon, to Dorset on the English Channel coast. And so I spent the first year, that's 2003 to 2004, in this town called Exmouth. And it was such an amazing experience and such a challenging one that I think I began to write about the experiences almost immediately. But the whole experience was such a difficult one. I mean, I was so alienated in that space. I was often so unhappy in that space. But I also found it so immensely intriguing that I really have been preoccupied with writing about this. I mean, for essentially what is, I've been obviously for like almost 20 years, I've been writing several poems about this. And so, you know, I got an opportunity to attend a residency early last year. And at that point, I was working on this chapbook. But the interesting thing is that certain new poems kind of came to the fore at that point. And the title poems, the title poem in two parts was actually one of those new poems. And it just made perfect sense to me that the collection would then be named Jurassic Coast. For other reasons, which I guess, we'll discuss in a while as well. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah.
A very long-winded response.
No, how often do we get the opportunity to talk to the poet, to talk to the writer, and find out the true meaning behind things? Because I tell you, I don't know what I would have been able to guess from just looking at the title
Right.
alone and
Yeah.
looking
Yeah.
at, the eponymous, because you have two poems in here, so you have two parts that,
Right.
the title.
Mm-hmm.
Now that you said it's a place. And it's
Right.
intriguing that you mention Exmouth. That's how you pronounce it.
Right. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Because you know what was going on here. And interestingly enough, that is the poem that I selected. That's the one that stood out to me when I opened the book.
Right.
Title, because what are we going to say here in the Caribbean and Trinidad? And people might say I'm terrible, but I was saying Exmouth,
Yeah. And to be honest, I think like for a time I was also saying that. I think it's a friend of mine who had lived in England. I mean, that's obviously before I traveled there.
Right.
That's exactly what I was saying, Exmouth. Right? But my friend said, no, remember it's Exmouth, just as you pronounce Plymouth,
Okay.
But I guess, things we learn.
And that is the one that stuck with me, especially
Mhm.
as your episode on the today that it's in, Valentine's Day. I don't know what would be your, interpretation of it as being as the writer, but this was stood out to me, in just looking at the lines of the poem, and I found, there's like something romantic, there's this relationship, something coming out in it. So
Right.
mouth, I say, oh, that's an interesting title.
Okay, okay, I get you. I get you.
So it really drew me into that. My idea was a little bit more romantic because,
I hear you. Yeah, I
to
hear you.
please,
Hmm.
you have the book with you there? You have,
Yes, I do.
so the poem we're talking about is actually on page 14, which is
Yeah,
Memory.
that's Memory Xmas. Okay.
Yes. Can you do the first three stanzas for us?
Okay, no problem. No problem at all. So, on these streets, flanked by row houses, I march from A to B through an hour's oppressive cold. Then, sudden, potent, as a heaviness thrown, the musk smell of him, blue hills, the hue of those evenings, smoky white and indigo, he and I beneath a streaked melancholic sky, walking, first on soft pitch, then where the paved road slips with a kissing of teeth into dirt.
Lovely.
Thank you.
What was the inspiration behind this, knowing that now Exmouth is a place, and of course our imagination go off and we'd say, oh, this poet, will meet some man there and having some experiences and they won't mean this. Because there are four stanzas, write the book and you
right.
to the rest. But what's the inspiration for that one?
Well, to be honest, so I didn't meet anyone there. I think I was too much of a wallflower when there for that. But this poem, so I think the emphasis here is on memory. And so I think because of the prevailing isolation that I experienced there, in many ways I existed in Exmouth in my head, if that makes sense. Because, I was so used to engaging and interacting with people, to having friends, to going out, to, to laughter, communication. But in Exmouth, I spent quite a lot of time alone. And, quite often, I mean, I'm a writer and, memory plays such a critical role to me. Right. So in this poem, I'm actually remembering, I'm remembering a man, right, with whom I had a relationship back in Trinidad. And you'd notice as well that landscape is important, is critical in this poem as well. Yeah. So I'm remembering, right, I'm remembering, the landscape and the scenery which I associated with him, Yeah.
Yeah, the titles are really, and we'll get into some more of those, really striking. And I like that there is this, how do you call it, connection between the Caribbean setting, landscape, and terminology, like in a subtle obia. And then you have, the Jurassic Coast kind of following it there. So you have the kind of twinning and merging of these ideas that you kind of speak about.
Yeah, so it's... Go
ahead.
No, I was about to say, it's interesting that you would say that. I think I'm happy, to hear you say that. I think at one point, I mean, like when I was writing, perhaps very soon after Exmouth, I don't think that connection, I always felt that very clear, defined connection to Trinidad and Tobago and to the Caribbean. But I think that emerged in the later years, so I'm happy to hear you say that. And it's always something I find a bit challenging about writing these poems, because there's as I mentioned, a kind of overwhelming alienation I feel. And sometimes that finds its way into sometimes I find sometimes even the diction, right? But I think as I have grown, as a poet, I have then been able to integrate more of, myself, my identity as a Caribbean person into the writing itself, even in the metaphors I use. I'm not entirely satisfied with it at all. I know that there's so much more I have to do where that is concerned. Right? But I have seen some growth,
and it's interesting listening to you because, as someone who we study and we look at Caribbean poetry, and then having you as a real life Caribbean poet here, saying some of the things that you've heard other poets say in terms of their experiences. So you mentioned the isolation, the alienation, and those themes of identity that always seems to pop up for us Caribbean, places. So, we really continuing that connection of those kind of themes with the experience of Caribbean people when they travel abroad, especially to
England. So true.
So how do you decide which experiences to write about, and which ones to keep personal?
Such a good question. That's such a good question. I think in this collection of poems, and I would say perhaps collections, because there is Jurassic Coast, etc., which examines the first year, But there's another series of poems which I've written, which, you know, really focuses on the second day I spent, which I spent in the West Midlands. I think there is very little that I am unwilling to write about. I think I have written, and because I've been writing about this for so long, I have challenged myself to perhaps embrace and engage with the themes and the topics that previously I might have considered too much or taboo, etc. So I am writing about quite a lot. I don't know. I mean, perhaps in terms of I don't know if I can answer this, but in terms of the second year, perhaps there are certain super personal details that I wouldn't, or I would be very careful about how I treat with those. But Caribbean poets are fearless. And so I challenge myself to try to be that and to try to do that and to write as openly as possible. That's such a good question. I think I am not perhaps always engaging emotionally with some of what I felt here. Perhaps in that sense, there may be certain things that, areas that may have been perhaps a little too difficult. But I am challenging myself to write very openly about much of the experience here.
Yeah,
I think, sure, go ahead.
Yeah, I was saying it's clear that, your surroundings, obviously, even from the title, some of what we are seeing in the poems themselves inspire the poetry.
Right.
And you brought up the themes, and I think some of them are coming out in your experience, even if not maybe in these specific poems that you've chosen here, the isolation, alienation, the identity. But what universal themes do you want to convey through the poems that you're writing about your experiences abroad? What themes do you want to convey through them?
Well, so to be honest, because I am particularly concerned with history and with geography, and I am so invested in, ideas about like the movement of peoples and colonialism and enslavement. I find that I am, I'm always writing about belonging. I'm always writing about identity, cultural difference, racism. So even when I am writing what I consider my Trinbagonian poems, these are the concerns that I have, right? And so in a sense, there's a convergence between what I have written about England and what I am writing about home as well. That makes sense.
Being in line with those themes that you're talking about, are there any themes or elements in your work that you find resonate differently with different audiences? Because you're writing about two experiences, two landscapes, geographical landscapes, and two different kind of cultures in themselves. So do you find that there is also that divergence in terms of the elements of works that resonate differently with your readers?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And so for instance, I did a reading at Corsicana in Texas last year. This was just an example. And I felt that the audience was particularly receptive. It was, I think, perhaps the best reading in terms of the audience response I've ever had. So it's a very valid question. And I guess that is why sometimes it's helpful to know kind of like, it's helpful, but perhaps not always realistic to have like an audience profile, or, to know who kind of like the demographic of your audience and so on. But yes, I hope I've answered your question. I tend to get like different responses among different groups as well.
It's interesting that you said you were reading in Texas, yeah? And you're writing from somewhat of a Caribbean perspective about an experience taking place
Sure.
in England and there. So to hear that something about your poem resonated with, I don't know if your audience were Caribbean people, because sometimes that it could be the Caribbean diaspora.
Right.
It resonated with someone in North America, I think what's coming out and that resonates with people just worldwide is that idea of, we're human beings and we're connected by isolation and alienation and our sense of identity if we are part of some sort of diaspora. So it was interesting to see that you have these two geographical landscapes and experiences that you're writing about, the Caribbean and England. And then you have this North American experience where somebody's responding to something based on those two experiences. So that's interesting too. What I noted as well was, just in following the poems through, Exma, Jurassic Coast, even in the title Wheat going through here, you have these, I don't know if you call them domestic or cooking motifs, the kneading of the dough and the garden and the bread and the wheat. I don't know if that's what you obviously is your work from. Is that deliberate? And tell me more about that. Those very domestic images of kneading on the little pot and yeah.
Right. So, interestingly, I am always writing about bread, right? As you've mentioned, I'm writing about it in wheat, and it appears in a subtle obeah.
Right.
And to be honest, in several of the poems I've written
as well, yeah.
Right, exactly.
A fist from a basin of dough.
Right. Yeah. So symbolically, bread is really important to me. But bread itself also holds tremendous value for me. I think I'm writing about it for several reasons. I think on one level, bread really, it epitomizes the very complex nature of the human being to me. Because if we think about it, it's something so material, so physical. And if we consider the work that goes into it, the kneading and the punching down, etc., it's such a, I like to think of it as a muscular thing. But then it's formed by a process which is almost magical, almost like alchemical.
Right.
And yeah, it kind of symbolizes very well, for me at least, the duality of the human being, of that physical and physical material, and yet kind of spiritual self, if you'd like to call it that. So there's that. But I think bread also it's also a very kind of feminine thing for me. And in many of my poems, it symbolizes women's work. There's always something for women to do. There's always some task, some chore, etc. Whether it's in the kitchen, or it's cleaning or washing, etc. I mean, even as someone who doesn't have children, it's something I connect with, that this exists. But I think in these poems, I'm also concerned with the fact that for women, it's sometimes so difficult to engage with what I like to call it the subtle self, or the more immaterial self, etc. And so we are always kind of engaged in these physical things to the detriment of the other self and the goals and the things that really can inspire us. right? Perhaps, I mean, that's not always the case. And so, right, and so I think in a subtle obia, there is that conflict taking place. And I felt that conflict very strongly when I was much younger. But I have actually resolved um, a lot of that now as I've grown older because I have prioritized, um, the self-actualization and the achieving of goals, etc. That's pretty important to me. But I am still writing about, I continue to write about this conflict as well. On another level, bread. So I am my family on both sides. My mother's family, father's family, they are both from Tobago. I was actually born in Tobago. And even though I've lived here for several years, and bread is very closely linked to my connection to Tobago and perhaps estrangement from Tobago as well. When I think of Tobago, I think of that kind of very close connection to the land, right? To the earth. And I see this in those of a certain generation, my parents and grandparents and so on. But as someone who feels a bit removed, I feel close to it, yet removed from it. I think bread is almost like the next best thing almost. The dough is almost the next best thing, right? So I may not be plunging my hands into the earth, but I am doing that with the dough. I'm always baking, always, and that I feel is very representative of how I understand and engage with my identity as someone who was born in Tobago, right? For what it's worth.
I always thought, and even in reading, because it flows throughout, this motif, this symbol, the dough, the bread, the kneading, and in reading it and sitting with it. And I say, I think for us too, I don't know what you would think, that that's part of the Caribbean experience, part of the non-Western country experience, part of the people of color experience, because bread and wheat is so important to our diet, so important to our versatility, how bread can go a very long way, and when you talked about well, you have to read her poems. She describes it very well. Very vividly. The kneading. There's something very sensuous in some of it in terms of the imagery that takes place there. And when you were talking about bread being important to you, your family, Tobago, and so forth, I say it's such a pervading thing because when you bake bread, it's so versatile. It kind of captures the whole house. You have the whole sometimes the neighbors smelling the bread. But I like that you focus on the ingredients that you put in there and the kind of texture you can always feel, the fingers through pulling it together in terms of the ingredients. Because I keep thinking it's such a versatile thing, also being very important to people in the Caribbean. We are bread people.
And to be honest, in Tobago, there's a tremendous tradition of baking bread. So just simply put, that's also part of it.
Yes. Yeah, the baking of it, the sharing of it. I think, as well, putting together the ingredients and you leave one out or you overdo it on one, that impacts the kind of bread that you would get as well, But I was interested to see those sorts of imagery coming through there as well. So you do you have any Caribbean writers and poets who have influenced your work or influenced your style of writing?
Yeah. So I love, I was just thinking about this, how much I love Richard George's work. I think he is, his work is exceptional. It is, there's a quietness about it. I'm hesitant to say almost a perfection, but there is something that resonates so strongly with me, in his work. And I think he has said that he writes and he edits crazily. And I think that comes across very powerfully in his work. So there's a Recibaran whose work I really like, and she's an awesome poet, a fearless poet as well. But I also like the work of, for instance, some US poets like Natasha Trethewey, Tracy K. Smith, Terrence Hayes. I mean, going back to the Caribbean, obviously I am blown away by Walcott's work. All right. And
landscape. He is very focused on landscape as well. So you do have that in your poetry.
Yeah, I am
person, or sees like a landscape. Yeah.
Sure, yeah. I mean, certainly Walcott is the book I return to many times, and I feel like I need a kind of resetting almost. So I am, particularly impressed by his work, and I'm always reading his work as well. But there's so many others. There's so many others. I'm currently reading Measures of Expatriation, rereading it. All right. By Capileo.
Okay.
And I think that book is unbelievable.
Take a look at it.
It's unbelievable in its scope as well.
Yeah. So I know you mentioned earlier, and you have been part of the Cropper Foundation Caribbean Writers Workshop and the Corsicana residency that you referenced earlier. How do these different creative spaces influence your writing process, or did they?
They have influenced my approach, I would say, significantly. I think the Cropper residency was perhaps like the first time. I think that was more or less my first residency, but it was really significant to me because it was the first time that I was able then to meet other writers who, were with the same level of commitment and dedication. And so, I mean, interestingly, prior to Cropper, I did work alongside some other writers in a small group led by Monique Ruffy called the St. James Writers Room. So that was also critical. But in terms of residencies, Cropper was my first residency. And it was awesome. It was awesome. Just, the opportunity to sit and really engage with other writers at the, more or less the same stage of their careers and so on, and provide feedback and really enjoy and benefit from the insights provided by Merle Hodge and by Funcho Ayejina at that point. That was a tremendous opportunity. And I mean, after that, you could almost, yes, I considered myself a writer, right, but I think certainly after Cropper, I became even more invested and even more engaged, and residencies, retreats are always an opportunity to grow, right? And certainly one which I would advise other writers to certainly consider, because I know for various reasons there are writers who don't do residencies, perhaps they are unable to access them, but they have been tremendous opportunities for me, right? Some more than others, in all honesty, some more than others.
So in keeping with that questioning of the Cropper Foundation, did you notice what kind of shifts in your writing, if any, did you notice from after, emerging from the workshop or having been through the workshop?
So one of the critical aspects of of the Cropper residency was the certainly, yes, workshopping, but the critical feedback you were given by the facilitators as well as your fellow writers and poets. And some of them are awesome, are sharp, are knowledgeable. Many of them, I remember one particular writer, that's Melissa Hazelwood. I think she was the one who pointed me in the direction of Tracy K. Smith and Natasha Trethewey, and that was tremendous to me. And so it is a widening of your horizon, sorry to use the cliche, and of your perspective. And yeah, I must say Cropper was awesome. As many of them have been. Another residency that was that has proven tremendous was the MoCo residency in 2018. And the focus there was poetry. And again, that was mind-blowing because we had the opportunity to work along with Richard Georges and Raymond Antrobus. That residency was particularly important to us. I'm saying to me, let me not speak for anyone else. It was particularly important to me because all of the different sessions were geared towards very, very sensitive, but they were geared towards the Caribbean writer and to concerns that we would have as emerging Caribbean writers, Caribbean poets. Very well chosen, but very open, very relaxed. Yeah, I mean, just thinking about it now, I mean, it's something that I miss so much because certainly in the Caribbean space, it's not something that you would, you'd find it very easily. And so most of the time, I find that I am working more or less alone, right? But that particular workshop was tremendous, I must say.
Yeah, and in recent years, you won the Bocas Lit Fest Emerging Writers Fellowship for poetry. You know, and then later on, this chapbook that we're currently discussing was published. So that's a pretty significant achievement. You know, how did this particular recognition and winning that affect your approach to your craft?
Okay. So this winning that fellowship was life-changing as well, because I think recognition on one level, but more importantly, validation, because this is a very interesting space in which to work as a writer, as a dedicated writer, because there's so much that inspires us here in this space, Trinidad and Tobago, and the Caribbean by extension. There's so much that inspires us. There's so much to write about. At the same time, there are so few opportunities. And so engaging in this craft is an act of resistance, is an act of bad mind, as we say, in a sense. And you really have to embrace that you are on a level in a space that will not afford you certain opportunities. And so when I remember the first time I found out about this scholarship, I was like blown away. This fellowship, sorry, because it was something new, right? But I think the validation that certainly I was doing something, I had been doing something right. Poetry is so challenging, so I felt like, okay, perhaps I'm getting somewhere, right? And the prizes were again awesome. The mentorship. I remember even when I attended the residency in Corsicana, and I told them about this fellowship, and I told them there were several prizes involved. They were particularly impressed by the fact that there was a mentorship, and that mentorship meant that I could choose anyone, they didn't dictate to me, right? So I had the ability to choose, and I chose Hannah Lowe, and Hannah has been awesome as well,
So what advice would you give to emerging Caribbean poets? I heard you mention earlier, poetry is difficult. It's crazy, about navigating, this landscape of going into becoming a poet, writing poetry,
right.
publishing, navigating fellowships and prizes. What advice would you give to emerging Caribbean?
Okay, so I mean, a dimension of this that I didn't mention just a few minutes ago is that, okay, social media exists, right? And I am very thankful for that. And so even if Trinidad, the environment for artists here is essentially very oppressive, there are opportunities on the outside which you may be able to access, but again, that depends on specific factors. But try to find as much as possible links with the outside. Try to find resources, um, find a way to make links with poets, other poets, right? And I need to take this advice as well because I don't always. So that kind of allows you a certain level of freedom that you don't have here, and would allow you certain opportunities as well. But as a Caribbean, if you are a Caribbean poet or you have aspirations of being, it is a difficult space to inhabit.
I want my listeners to know that you empower minds and you ignite curiosity. Thank you, Jannine.